another wonderful laser. I should mention, in addition to the Philosophical Baby, I write a column for the Wall Street Journal that you can find on my website if you're interested in more. And what I'm going to do today, very briefly, is tell you about some empirical work and some ideas that we've been working on, really trying to explore some of the origins of creativity and our consideration of possibility. And this is work that started with work in my book, The Philosophical Baby. And that book is really about what children who people haven't paid very much attention to in the past can tell us about really fairly profound questions about what we're like as human beings in general. And what I've been doing in my scientific work over the last 15 years or so is trying to figure out how it's possible for babies and young children to learn as much as they do. And we know that they're literally the best learners of anything, machine or system that we know of in the universe. How is it possible for them to do it? And for the last 15 years, I and others have been exploring the idea that they're thinking about the world and learning about the world in very much the same way that the Reverend Thomas Bayes proposed that ideal statistician or scientist should be learning and thinking about the world. And you can see the Babies and Thomas Bayes have the same expression and the same haircut. But more significantly, they actually have the same things going on inside. So what we've demonstrated is that even very young children and babies are implicitly, unconsciously doing some of these rather sophisticated calculations and computations. And basically, the Bayesian idea is to think of children as being like little scientists, people who are going out, testing hypotheses, checking the data, revising their hypotheses in the light of the data, checking the hypotheses against the data, revising further, and so on. And in doing that, they're using probabilities. That's one of the central. That's one of the central concepts. One of the central ideas. Now. If you've ever taught or taken a statistics class, you'll know that even adults have a great deal of difficulty in actually explicitly understanding statistics. So it might seem quite surprising to suggest that even very young children are using statistics to figure out the structure of the world around them. But fortunately, when we're testing young children, we can't actually do things like ask them to tell us what a conditional probability is. The way that we test their understanding of things like statistics is by giving them a real system to figure out, and then giving them data or evidence about that system, and then seeing what kinds of conclusions about the system they draw from the data. And the work I'm going to tell you about today is in collaboration with my colleagues Thomas Griffiths and Chris Lucas, who's now at the University of Edinburgh. And we were especially interested in whether children could use this kind of statistical information, not just to infer, say, that one thing caused another, but could they use it to infer some abstract principles about how a system worked. And here's the experiment. All of our experiments involve this incredibly high-tech machine that may cost $20 that's called the blicket detector. And the blicket detector is a box that lights up and plays music when some things, namely blickets, are put on it, and when other things that aren't blickets, don't make it go. And in fact, in the case of this blicket detector, the way it works is that blickets have blicketosity in them, and it's the blicketosity that actually makes the detector go. Now, of course, the reality is that there's a graduate student behind a counter who's pressing a button, but fortunately nobody ever, that matrix-like Plato's cave solution is not something that the kids ever figure out. So here's a blicket detector task, and we can actually have an audience full of you to figure out this task. So here's what happens. There's 3 blocks. They're actually different shapes, but we counterbalance, so we'll call them just D, E, and F. And D goes on the block, and nothing happens 3 times. And then E goes on and nothing happens. D and F together go on and the box lights up. D and F together go on and the box lights up again. So how many people think that D is a blicket? How about E? How about F? Okay, nodding. Okay, so you guys are as smart as the Berkeley undergraduates, as I would expect from a parent's audience, but you are not as smart as the 4-year-olds in the Child Studies Center. Because suppose you actually saw first this sequence of events. So you saw that A goes on the block detector and nothing happens, B goes on and nothing happens, C goes on and nothing happens, this combination nothing happens. The only time it works is if you put A and C on together. If you saw those events, what you might conclude is not so much something about the individual blickets as a general principle about how this machine works. And that general principle is that the machine works in terms of combinations of blocks, not individual blocks. So individual blocks won't make it go. A and C by themselves won't. But if you combine A and C together, then that's the secret for making the machine go. So instead of working on an individual principle, individual blocks make it go or not, this machine works on this combination principle. And if you saw that first and you go back to this sequence of events, you might assess this sequence differently. Now you might say, oh, now wait a minute, maybe it's the combination of D and F together that's what you need to make the machine go, even though the individual blocks don't work. So you might change your mind about it. And what we did was simply do exactly the experiment I just did with you. We did it with Berkeley undergraduates and with 4-year-olds. And either we gave them training that showed that the individual blocks were making the machine go, or we gave them just the sequence I just showed you, this sequence, which suggests that the machine operates on this abstract combination principle. And then they got exactly the same test sequence that you saw. And what we did was we asked them various questions. We asked them which one was a blicket, the way we did with you, but then we also asked them to just make the machine go. And we saw what they would do if they made the machine go. And here's the result. When there was training on the individual block, then both the adults and the children sensibly chose to put just a single object on the machine. But when we trained them on the combination principle, the children chose multiple blocks to put on the machine, which of course is the rational, sensible thing to do if you think the machine works on this combination principle. The adults, on the other hand, continued to do exactly what they did in the previous condition. So in other words, the adults, even when we gave them data that went against their original hypothesis, just stuck to the original hypothesis. The children were actually much better at discovering something that was unusual, that wasn't what they expected, given the data, but that fit the data, than the adults, who were much more likely to stick to the thing that they already thought was true. And we found this now across 5 different studies, not just with blicket detectors, but with people, with lots of different kinds of hypotheses, different domains, different age ranges. This very general pattern that when you're learning a general and unusual hypothesis, the children and younger learners are actually better, consistently better than adult learners. And what the adult learners do is take what they already know, apply the things that they already know to the situation at hand, ignore the new data that goes against what they've thought already. What the children do is take the new data and use it to actually find a new hypothesis, a new explanation of what's going on. Now, why would it be? Why would you see this pattern? Well, we think this is part of a broader distinction that people in computer science and machine learning make. And it's a distinction between 2 kinds of learning. You can think of it as a distinction between exploitation versus exploration. Exploitation is trying to learn in order to accomplish something. So you want to accomplish a particular end, you need to learn something, you just learn in a way that's going to accomplish the particular goal you have in mind. And in exploratory learning, instead, you're just looking around trying to find out about things. One way you could think about a problem like that problem I just showed you with the blicket detector is think about it as if there's a big space, a big box full of hypotheses about how that machine could work. And some of those hypotheses are very close to where you already are, right? So you're somewhere in that space, you're thinking, okay, it's individual blocks. Some hypotheses are very close. Some hypotheses are wild or crazy. They're not quite out of the box, but they're in the far corners of the box, right? And the question is, how are you going to decide how to search through that enormous space of hypotheses? And in computer science, they distinguish between 2 kinds of searches, a low-temperature search and a high-temperature search. In a low-temperature search, you just look very close to where you already are. So you're just considering small changes, small tweaks to what you already know. In a high-temperature search, instead of just considering small tweaks, you go all over the place. You bounce around. You try this, and it doesn't really work. Then you try something completely different. You try things that seem crazy, that make no sense at all initially. And each one of those techniques has advantages and disadvantages. If you do the low-temperature search, you're very quick to settle on the right answer, but you might miss a better answer that's way off in the other part of the space. On the other hand, if you do the high-temperature search, there's going to be a long time when you're just going to be screwing around in the space and nothing's going to happen, and you have to eat in the meantime, and this is not going to help you to eat. But you're more likely to find this unusual low probability answer. And in computer science, the typical way of resolving this exploit versus explore tension is to do something called simulated annealing, And simulated annealing means you start out with this wild, crazy high temperature search, and then you slowly settle into the low temperature search. And essentially, the hypothesis that we've had is that childhood is evolution's way of doing simulated annealing. That children are starting out as high temperature searchers and then become low temperature searchers. And that makes sense out of that data that I just told you about, right? So the kids what's happening is we give the kids the blicket detector information, and instead of just saying, okay, here's the obvious thing you think that usually causes work individually, they go off and try something unusual and unlikely that actually fits the data better. Here's an example of what I think high temperature, and this is an appealing idea because if any of you have ever hung around with 3-year-olds, this metaphor about they bounce around crazily through the space is almost a literal description of what 3-year-olds are like.
Oh, yeah.
Here's an intellectual version of it. This is a little boy in Christine Laguerre's lab, and she did sound?
This makes that light up the box. How about this?
I think is that loud enough?
And the other side.
And what you can see is, so this little boy, first she showed him that red ones made it go and yellow ones didn't. Then she showed him an anomaly. One of the red ones didn't work. And now she's asking him to explain it. So she just says,
this one's light up, and this one.
Why did this happen?
So that means it's making this light up. I don't know. Oh, it's because this needs to be like this, and this needs to be like that. That's why. Probably the boxes are the wrong way.
So it's probably the boxes are the wrong way, and he suggests to the experimenter that you try this.
What should we do now?
Oh, because the light goes only to here, not here. Oh, the bottom of this box has electricity in here, but this doesn't have electricity. It's lighting up. So you need to put 4. So we need to put 4 on this one to make it light up, and 2 on this one to make it light up.
Okay, so that little boy is kryptonite cute, as Christine says, and incredibly articulate, but it turns out that he's actually quite typical of what happens when you give children an anomaly and ask them to explain it. And he goes through, I've counted 9 different hypotheses, and an incredibly wide range, from the number to the location to the color to the shape to the position of those blocks, and each time with just a little bit of data, he bounces off to a new part of the space. And I think that that's actually what we see with 3- and 4-year-olds all the time. Now, that might be true, but you might ask, well, why would it be true? Well, one of the things that we know, one of the puzzles about human beings, is that we have this incredibly long childhood, much longer than any other species. And we have many adaptations that seem to be designed to deal with the great investment we have in these babies who are useless and immature and can't take care of themselves for a really long time. My son is 27. At least until 27, we're still writing checks. And it turns out that even if you look at hunter-gatherer cultures, chimpanzees are gathering as much food as they're eating by the time they're 5. In hunter-gatherer cultures, children aren't doing that till they're 15. So why would it be? Why have this long childhood? Well, it turns out that there's actually a strong correlation across many, many different species between how long a period of childhood is and how flexible and smart the animals are as adults. So this is the New Caledonian crow. This is an animal that has incredible tool use abilities, as sophisticated as chimpanzees. And the fledglings for the New Caledonian crow, those babies are fledglings for as long as 2 years, which is a very long time in the life of a bird. Our friend the domestic chicken, with apologies to any chicken lovers in the audience, very, very good at pecking grain, not much good at doing anything else. And those chicks are mature within the space of weeks, and a lot of their abilities are in place in interesting experiments literally from the time they're born. When we actually look at the Caledonian crow babies, you start to understand this. In the wild, these animals use their tool using to fashion digging tools out of palm leaves. And what you see is that for that first 2 years, they just screw up over and over and over again. So they try to put it in the wrong way, they put it upside down, they put it the wrong way. But of course, as everyone in the Valley will tell you, failing quickly and often is the secret to innovation. And that seems to be the crow's secret. But of course, the real secret is that while they're failing, there's a mama crow who's actually sitting there and tapping her foot and willing to keep dropping termites into their gullies. If not, write mortgage and tuition checks. And in fact, you can see this change even very recently in our evolutionary history. So this is a comparison of dentition of dental records in Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and you can see that the Homo sapiens babies, if you look at their teeth, are maturing faster than the Neanderthals. And from an evolutionary fossil record, this is a very, very clear difference, and a very quick difference. Our evolution, the evolution of our cognitive capacities, was absolutely going hand in hand with this extremely extended period of immaturity, and also with things like, speaking proudly, grandmothers who don't exist in any other species, women who actually continue to live past their fertility, who seem to be designed to be able to provide an investment in these helpless, immature babies. And as you might expect, you can see this. I'm sorry, this slide isn't. Oh, actually, it's too bad it's not working. Okay, I'll just have to tell you about it. As you might expect, you can see this in brain development as well. So this is a slide that shows the. This is a slide that shows the fact that early on in development, there's this incredibly plastic, flexible brain. Many, many, many new neural connections are being formed. And then that's succeeded by a period of synaptic pruning, when the connections that are used a lot are reinforced, and the ones that aren't disappear, are pruned and gotten rid of. And what you can't see in this slide, unfortunately, is that if you look at, this is the visual cortex where this process is done by the time the babies are about 1. But if you look at this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, sort of the chief executive office of the brain, the part that is responsible for things like controlling our impulses or doing long-term planning, this process is particularly extended, not finished until people are in their mid-20s. And often that absence of prefrontal control is perceived as being a deficit, a downside. It's a reason why we should be making our kids have better frontal lobes earlier and earlier. But from the perspective of this trade-off between exploration and exploitation, it may actually be an advantage. So not having as many capacities for inhibition, for impulse control, for long-term planning, might actually be an advantage if what you want is this kind of high-temperature surge. And in fact, if you look in the neuroscience literature, there are several interesting examples where, for example, actually changing someone's brain, you can actually put a current through their brain in a way that keeps it from functioning as well. And it turns out that if you zap the frontal lobes of people, they actually do better on a divergent thinking task, a task like being able to think of as many different uses as you can for something. If you look at the brains of jazz musicians when they're improvising, you actually see inhibition of those frontal control areas compared to when they're playing from a score. And what we're doing right now is trying to see if we zap adult frontal lobes, will they look more like the children in our blicket detector task? So the moral of this work, our slogan, as I say, is the reason why we have this long childhood, the argument goes, is to provide us with this protected period when we don't actually have to work for a living, in which we can just go out and explore. And I think that message, the message that evolution's designed children to do that, should have an effect on how we educate children, obviously. at the moment there's actually more and more pressure on schools and even preschools to be pedagogical rather than allowing this kind of general creative play. And I think it's also a message for the society at large. So in a sense, what scientists and artists are allowed to do is literally be big children. So scientists and artists, the reason why that works is by giving a group of people a protected period in which they can do this kind of wide-ranging exploration of possibility and play. That's the strategy, that's the technique for actually learning the things that we need to learn, whether it's as individual grown-up adults or as a society at large. So let me end there.